facade lab, and if you know that name, you might recognize that as being related to the Sleeping Baby story. And we have Martha, who's also going to be speaking. I believe both those modules together. So these are the creators of this module that are going to be delivering it to you. So if remember, if you have a question, feel free to ask it. I'll try to repeat it so we can get it sort of out. And I don't know which one of you wanted to go first, but it's up to you. And you have Green over there who will be something for you.
I always say two things at the beginning. I want to know that I'm originally from sub-Saharan Africa, a country called Zambia, which is one of those that was hardest hit by the epidemic. And I'm also living with HIV and the mom of 2 HIV-negative children. So I'm very passionate about this. So we're going to be talking about perinatal HIV infection, so infection in children and infants. The barriers to cure, you guys already heard about the latent reservoir, antiretroviral therapy and the reservoir, the latent reservoir, cases of virologic remission, and the ethics of ART cessation in children and the challenges. So perinatal HIV infection. HIV infection that is transmitted from mother to children happens in 3 ways. One is in utero during pregnancy, intrapartum during the delivery, and postpartum during breastfeeding. I think one of the things that I'm passionate about and that really drives me crazy that it's still happening is that the transmission from mother to child is preventable. Here we may not see a lot of children being born with HIV, but in Africa or around the world, there's 700 children daily being born with HIV. Antiretroviral therapy for mother during pregnancy and after the baby, after the birth, prevents HIV transmission. So in my case, I was on antiretroviral therapy during both the births of my 2 sons. And as soon as they were born, they were put on therapy or put on AZT for several weeks. It differed in the 2 babies, but they were put on therapy so that, I call it backup, so that they, to prevent that transmission. ART during breastfeeding prevents transmission through breast milk. Formula feeding, when safe and affordable, prevents further exposure to the baby. So, in my case, I formula fed both of my kids. I do not breastfeed. And the risk of perinatal transmission during pregnancy and delivery, when the mother does not receive ART, it's 15 to 37% of the infants that acquire HIV, and when the mother receives ART, it suppresses HIV viral load by 1 to 4%. I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's like huge. So, what are the risks? What are the risk factors for mother to child transmission? One of them is knowledge of HIV status. Some people don't know, as we know, but people are familiar with the continuum. So many people are HIV positive, only so many of them know. So if you don't know your HIV status, that's a huge risk. Acquiring HIV infection during pregnancy. If you happen to become HIV positive as you're pregnant, as soon as you become HIV positive, it's an acute phase, or you have a lot of virus, and so it's very possible to infect the baby then. Low CD4 counts and high viral load, obviously. Maternal ART and infant prophylaxis, if that's not there, like it was in my case, obviously children can get infected. Access to care, which is the case in places like Africa, and stigma stigma. Some women, these are, whenever I'm talking statistics, I'm seeing faces, so these are people that I know. Even when they do become diagnosed with HIV and they're pregnant, they're afraid of telling their family, they're afraid of telling their husbands, they're afraid of the stigma in the community as well. And so that is a risk, because then you won't take the precaution in order to stop preventing that.
Hello, Caitlin. Thanks for having me. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the reservoir, which you can review the major barriers. So in an infected individual, HIV infects CD4 positive T cells, something we talked about in the last session. And a majority of these cells go on to die due to the effects of the virus, but a small portion of them survive. And they go into a resting state or a dormant state that then accumulates and becomes related a state in which HIV is not expressed, but this reservoir can expand with delays in treatment or with delays in receiving antiretroviral therapy. And these cells survive for a very long time, perhaps for life. And so this is why HIV can be closely linked to antiretroviral therapy. These happy cells that last for a very long time. And normally these cells are used to defend against other pathogens. The memory cells are there to allow your body to defend itself against pathogens when you see them a second or a third or a fourth time. But in this sense, they're actually there. So these latent cells can reactivate if they're stimulated properly. And when an individual is not on therapy, HIV can be rekindled or remain to be rekindled, and obviously that is not the state that we want to be in. But when someone's on therapy, these cells can be reactivated and the HIV will not productively work. And so that's where we want everyone to be. So there's several approaches to cure. We talked about some of these. The one that I realize is missing on here is the bone marrow transplant, but clearly that's not one that we would probably consider for very effective. Some of the other ones are drugs that reactivate these HIV-infected Western cells and then go to the genetic modification of these cells or CD4 positive cells in general to prevent HIV entering the population is another approach. These are removing bigger nucleus, so they believe that's part of the C-serotype or etc. Boosting the immune system to kill residual virus suppressing cells, either through therapeutic vaccines that elicit from the antibodies or from other immune response, or monoclonal antibodies that are passively protect them from rekindling. And one of the other interesting things that we believe is that early antiretroviral therapy initiation can limit the size of the reservoir. I touched on this before, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So in perinatal HIV infection, so in a situation where an infant is infected because of their mother being infected, we have this unique characteristic, right, where we understand and we can more or less pinpoint when a child is infected, when an infant is infected. It's around the time of birth, or delivery, or perhaps in gestation, or breastfeeding. But we know pretty much around the time when they're infected, so we can act on that, right? We can provide therapy close to the time when they're infected, and if we leave the early therapy, it's effective in reducing the size of the or simply by initial. And we know that early therapy is good. It's particularly important. It decreases morbidity and mortality. Kids who are HIV infected, infants who are HIV infected, will die by the second birthday if they do not receive therapy. So so is critical to this. So giving them therapy is life-saving for them. It also reduces the size of the reservoir, as I mentioned earlier, and we believe this is the first step, perhaps, to long-term remission. It may also permit functional cure when combined with immune-based therapy, and by that we mean the control of HIV in the absence of So from these plots, it seems pretty clear that over time, as these children have aged, they've been on therapy, they've been biologically suppressed, that their reservoir sizes have diminished, which is exciting to us. And we didn't see this necessarily with children who were treated later or didn't have as long of care there. And so this is a schematic of how we think about the size of the reservoir in relation to when you begin anti-retroviral products. And so on the left-hand side, we have the timing of ART initiation. In this orange polygon, we have the size of the latent reservoir. In the blue triangle, we have the potential remission duration, if someone were to go wrong with therapy. And then the potential for bereavement reestablishment. And so if you start therapy, if an infant starts therapy very early, so within 2 days of birth, we're having minimal HIV exposure to that child, right? And the reservoir is probably fairly small relative to starting therapy later. If they were to go off therapy, we would hope that their duration would be longer in relation to others. And their potential for reestablishing bereavement would be relatively small. And as you increase the amount of time that passes between birth and when these children start therapy, you're increasing the exposure to virus. And you're probably increasing the size of the reservoir, decreasing the duration of remission you could potentially have, and increasing the probability that it's going to recommit. So we're going to discuss a few cases. So the Mississippi child is one that I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of. It's a well-known case. And this case was the first that allowed us to really start to say, okay, how does cure and long-term remission occur? And we don't necessarily know the answers to that question right now, but we do have a lot of really interesting evidence to inform what's going on now. Dr. Prasad's in the audience, so she's here to talk to you. If you have questions about Mississippi child in general, or specifically, you can talk to her. So this is the timeline of events of what happened. The child was born to an HIV-infected mother who received very little prenatal care, and the child had 2 separate tests for HIV within the first day of life that were positive for HIV. And the clinician decided to start therapy, an aggressive type of antiretroviral therapy at 30 hours of life. This child remained on therapy until she was 18 months old, and then basically stopped coming to clinic visits, stopped coming to follow up. And at 23 months, returned to the clinic, and no HIV was detected in the blood, which was shocking. And people were really, the clinician herself was very shocked by this. And so this began to be investigated, and this is where it's all from. She was in long-term remission for 27 months, and then last year rebounded a little bit before her birthday, when HIV was detected in the blood. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science. The inability to detect HIV in blood plasma while the child is not receiving antiretroviral therapy is referred to as long-term remission. Detection of HIV after long-term remission in the absence of any immune response to HIV shows that the child had a dormant reservoir. And the child's virus also closely matched the mother's virus, indicating that the virus was living in the body and she wasn't detected. So what did we learn from this? We learned that starting antiretroviral therapy very early in the time course of infection likely led to few HIV-infected cells that could be redundant, so limiting the size of this reservoir. And the small number of dormant cells took more than 2 years to rekindle infection after she got on therapy. And this permitted long-term remission, but not necessarily. So here's a timeline of some other children that you may or may not have heard about, and that also went off their therapy, have been on therapy for a number of years and went on therapy. So there was the Dublin child who initiated antiretroviral treatment quickly after birth, remained on it for about 4 years, and then rebounded after 8 days. Then there was a Canadian child who was on therapy for 3 years and started within 24 hours of birth and went on therapy after 3 years and rebounded in 14 days. And similar with the Milan child, with the Italian child who went on therapy within 4 days of birth and was on for 3 years and rebounded in 14 days. These are all in contrast to the Mississippi child who rerouted 828 weeks later, right? So the big question is the billion-dollar question is, what is it that made the Mississippi child go for so long and not this other child? So this is just a table showing some of the factors that may be associated with that. But we're not saying that this is what it is. There's many that could explain it. We don't know necessarily what it is yet. And so there's others that are given here at the bottom of the slide. So when these children were infected, whether they were infected in utero or in delivery, the viral load of the mother during delivery, HIV exposure duration and viral load, genetic differences like we talked about in the last session, ART adherence during those 3 or 4 years in those children receiving therapy, and co-infections, the reservoir size. They didn't always have their reservoir size genetically. And the viral strains and then the drug therapies they were on in the regimens and those. So all these stories have things in common. They all started as birth or viral therapy within hours or perhaps days since birth. None had detectable HIV in blood by standard clinical or ultra-sensitive assays while they were on therapy, and that's what led the clinicians to believe that they could possibly go off. And none had immune responses to HIV. And those who sucked had however. So now we're going to discuss a little bit about the ethics of cessation of therapy. So another child you may have heard of is the Long Beach child. And this child started therapy within 4 hours of birth. Had undetectable HIV and immune responses to HIV in their blood for more than 9 months, probably closer to 2 years now. But this child remains on therapy. This case is one that highlights that very early therapy can limit the size of the reservoir. And so you can see what's unclear this child is going to do. And I'm using this as an example of this type of child that you may consider an addict when it's take off therapy. And given the other cases of rebound, you might have ethical concerns about whether or not it would be appropriate to take this child off therapy. Yeah. Promise. But the potential benefit to the millions of people that could benefit from going on therapy and being remission and not have to take drugs for a long period of time may outweigh the risk of rebound if those children can be under care and can be watched closely and go back to their lives quickly. So we believe that this justifies a clinical trial, the development of a clinical trial to test whether very early antiretroviral therapy can lead to long-term remission. This is being organized by the Impact Network, the International Journal, and training of fellows and fees and clinical trial centers. This is referred to as the P1115 trial. The study objective is to study HIV remission, defined as 48 or more weeks off antiretroviral therapy among HIV-infected neonates in ART in 48 hours of birth. And the design set is a small proof of concept exploratory study that's happening in the US and sub-Saharan Africa at the time.
Can I ask a question? So how do you find new elite controllers if everybody's getting therapy with their form? Yeah, like people that, don't get infected for a really, really long time. How do you know if that's even possible if they're just getting drugs right away?
I guess you wouldn't unless you took them off therapy and you were able to monitor them, or genetically you were able to.
And those are the people that are being studied to find a cure for the elite controllers?
Yes.
So that would be like eliminating them. If they're being born and they could be an elite controller.
You wouldn't necessarily be eliminating them because they could still be an elite controller.
Right.
Therapy, right?
If you took them off therapy, so the therapy is ruining.
Not necessarily. I don't think so. I'm not certain that that's going to happen.
Okay.
But it's my understanding is that no, it wouldn't be ruining an elite controller.
Okay. So
Oh, sorry.
if they got taken off of ART, then they would just sustain and be okay if they were an elite controller. And then
Yeah,
okay.
I actually have an example of one because I worked with women living with HIV in DC, and there was a woman who had been on therapy for like 10 years and went through a tough period and just did not stop. And she people can have been like family or anything, and they're considering her.
Okay. I was under the impression that the ART eliminates that part of it, and that actual writing part of it being released.
So I was just going to ask, the Long Beach child and the Mississippi child, do they share any genetic traits? I know they both heterozygous for
Not that I'm aware of. We've done some studies that we have an elite that would point to them being, an elite girl or some other form of special case.
Even though the slide of this or information, but human trial design is try to do most trial transmission prevention first, if possible.
You mean by giving children preventive therapy or giving the mothers preventive therapy? Yeah, actually, the standard of care would always be used in terms of trying to prevent any infections that are happening before.
So just like you try to prevent say 1, 2, 3 times
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But in Africa, access is still not access the way it is here. I mean,
Right.
you know, that's,
My question was, is it trial design that it can? That's the first thing you do. It's not.
Right. As researchers, that's something that we have to do. We always have to try to prevent an infection. Right. So that's something that's always built into the study. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, we were talking about ethics. In my case, even in Germany, the ethical board says keep taking your medication. But it was my decision, actually, with my partner, to quit taking my medication because I was more concerned about the leukemia.
Okay.
And I was afraid that the chemicals would not be reduced. I was told later by Dr. Reuter that they would have, it would have been fine. But, so, I was a grown person, an adult, and I was able to use my own.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually something I'm going to discuss that here. So yeah, a couple of the ethical considerations surrounding ART cessation and functional curative is that very early treatment can have aggressive, with aggressive drug regimens can have toxic side effects, which is something that no mother wants to put their child through. And therapy discontinuation to assess remission can lead to drug resistance and increased seizure resource as well as other things. So there's other ethical implications, like Timothy was just mentioning, with very early ART initiation. One of these deals with consent. Here I have consent during labor and delivery, but also consent to the infant. An infant can't consent to be in research, and an infant can't consent to take drugs or to go off drug trade. So that's something that we also think about when we're working with children. The parents are hopefully acting in the child's best interest. Consent during labor and delivery for a mother is also an issue, right? For any of you who have children, you may or may not agree with this statement that you were able to make sound medical decisions while you were in labor. Right? So, would you be able to enroll in a clinical trial or enroll your infant? And hopefully you need to be more an infant in a clinical trial during that period. Hopefully you'd be able to enroll in other periods too, but that's something that we also have to think about. There's some social pressures around discontinuing antiretroviral therapy that are considered now that there are really stories of people we're also concerned about drug in adolescence. We start early therapy very, very early in children, from teens and adolescents and early adults past the frequency of our window assessment and the ability to emotionally support processes are also concerns. And there's many others. And there's many remaining questions. So here I'm just mentioning a few, but the last session did a great job discussing many of these questions. And when they really covered was how early is early enough for ART initiation? We don't really answer that question. Does it need to be within 4 hours of birth? Does it need to be within 4 days of catch it early, we catch it quick, in order to put them back on their feet so they don't experience consequences. And then what duration of remission is appropriate to refer to a person's cure. Timothy Brown is frequently cured. Mississippi child people say she was cured, but so there are questions we still have to do. And of course, there's many challenges. So as Barbara was just talking about, even the implementation of antiretroviral therapy is difficult, and early antiretroviral therapy is even more difficult, particularly in low-income settings, because we can't always diagnose infants with HIV when they're born. So if you're in rural Africa, it's actually to be somewhere in rural Zambia, they don't have the technology that we have to be able to diagnose kids with HIV right when they're born, right? Sometimes the turnaround time for understanding whether or not your child has HIV is 2 months. So that automatically knocks you out of that hopeful, that window that we're thinking about in terms of hours or days. And then that also brings up the point of need for that point of care diagnostic test. So we will use testing right away, right there. Working with children, we have low blood volumes that restrict our ability to study remission as thoroughly as we can in adults. So you can't take a lot of blood from an infant. If you try, you know that that's a very painful process. You can take a lot of blood from an adult if they're born. That limits our
goes crazy.
right. You're holding a baby that's squirming and squirming, and they get like blood, and the adult can be like, oh. So these are limiting our abilities. And then, as was also discussed in the last session, there's reservoirs and other bodily sites, such as the central nervous system or the gastrointestinal tract. And so, predominantly, research is done in blood because it's an easy place to study, or easier place to study than going to the central nervous system or the gut. So, some conclusions for infants: very early antiretroviral therapy to achieve remission in perinatal infection is biologically plausible. And what we mean by that is possible. It's possible. Mississippi Child showed us that it's possible. We don't know exactly how to do it yet, but it's possible. There's a potential for widespread global implementation, given the existing infrastructure for delivery of antiretroviral therapies to prevent child transmission. There's been a strong push to have that implemented in many places as far reaching as it can get. And so hopefully we can leverage that to start therapy earlier. And there's a potential to further lengthen HIV remission when we combine it with community therapeutics. So the vaccines we're talking about, the antibodies, antibodies, which would help control the virus before it becomes itself. So conclusions for older children and youth. So we're thinking about infants a little bit differently than we are with older children and youth, right? Because infants, you can act on when they're infected, but we have this whole population of kids who were infected and have been infected for a while, and they have been treated early. So we need to consider what we can do for them as well. So immunotherapeutic interventions that are safe and plausible for them would be a great option. Some will have the advantage of a lower our size because they've been on therapy for a long period of time, or maybe even have initiated it already. And most will benefit from the capacity of the immune response to reconstitute that reserve. So being on therapy for a long period of time has allowed their immune systems to more or less become stronger. And so they are benefiting from that. So we just want to acknowledge a lot of people who help support the research that we do. Johns Hopkins Children's Center, and there's Hopkins University Center for Age Research, National Institutes of Health, both the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the Institute of Child Health and Human Development. The impact group. There's a place with the NIH Foundation, AMFAR, and George Duke, all foundations that contribute substantially to this. Thank you.
I've got a quick question. For a while, I remember conversing with people on Facebook. I was told that the British Commonwealth was
British Commonwealth was suggesting ostrich therapy to individuals until they were maybe 200. 200 to 300 Singapore cells per mil. So,
I know that's happening and,
right,
I know that it's still there.
It's still the case.
yes,
Yeah, probably is the most part.
for adults. For adults.
Yeah, this is nothing else.
Right. Right, I'm saying for children, I'm not going to show I'm saying for children that start therapy basically it's really independent.
So you had mentioned that when you know a child is infected in real, like you have a time stamp, and then starting to talk about it within a day. But now we know that to prevent HIV in adults, you need to test. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the difference between adult resistance and children and why that might be different, a day and they're still infected versus, it's.
So, yeah, there's a lot going on there. So, the immune system in general between children and infants and adults is very different. Adults have been able to develop immune responses that are mature and we call them mature, but different than what children or infants have. And so they can fight a lot of other pathogens more easily, keep it a little bit better. Infants, on the other hand, are receiving, they're coming out of the mother. They've received a lot of the mother's blood, right? They've been exposed to a lot of the mother's blood and other body fluids. So they're kind of bringing a part of the mother with them. And so in that way, I think about it as, that it's already there when they're born. So perhaps you can't necessarily prevent it entirely. But with children, we can, right? So I guess that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's just that, when you think about tests, it's like one within 24 hours, and
Right.
then immediately prevent it, and you can go to I like that example, and there's something that's already infected.
Yeah, I guess that's the best way to start to look like.
Would you say removing ART therapy can cause higher levels of reservoirs or counts in that? What's the likelihood of an increase? All it says is can, and that slide doesn't say like the likelihood of something increasing in the reservoir, whatever the count.
So you're saying discontinuing antiretroviral therapy could increase the size of the reservoir?
Yeah, it said that somewhere in the slide, but I was curious
Yeah.
the likelihood of that.
So at this point, it's very likely because anytime that someone would reestablish viremia, they would be potentially infecting B cells that could go on to accumulate in the reservoir.
All right, thank you.
There's a question up here, there's two after.
Okay, thanks.
So if I'm not probably as educated as an officer, but if I'm a mother who has HIV and I'm delivering a child and you want to do research, how do you ask me and how are you telling me the potential risks and how are you presenting your program to me?
Okay, I don't actually do this part of it. I'm trained to do some of this. So there's a very long and arduous training that people go through in order to understand whether or not, first of all, you're confident to make the decision that you participate in a research study, and whether you are confident in looking out for your child and enrolling your child in a research study, first and foremost. And then there's an entire consent process that you must go through where you were told the risks and you were told the benefits and you were asked questions to make sure that you understand the risks and you understand the benefits. Nothing is ever hidden from you. You are informed of exactly what the study is looking at and what is going to be measured.
And if I were to contrast that, like maybe a little bit in Africa,
Could you use the mic, please?
oh, sure. When my generation of parents died, with the virus, and we're still seeing people die a lot more than they are here. And so sometimes, people talk about the idea of, well, it's almost like it's desperation. You're watching your baby die, and they will die by the time they're 2 years old, and even smaller than that, because you start seeing it. Because there are other different things that compound, there's nutrition, there's all these other things. But I think, as she has said, just understanding the process. When I was told about prevention to mother-to-child transmission, I was worried. I was still, thinking there was still a possibility. But I did what I could do in the best of my ability to prevent that, even though to me this was still a strange concept. Now this is, several years into it. But at that time when they were saying we can do this and you can have an HIV negative baby, it was still scary. But where we are, in places like Africa, I think you would make that decision because of the alternative.
There's a question.
I just wanted to respond to the question about how do you approach a mother and provision of a 3-drug regimen like this. So first with a clinical trial, the women that would be enrolled into that trial and the infants are women who did not receive any antiretroviral drugs during their pregnancy. So in other words, they didn't know they were infected or knew they were infected and didn't need drugs. So in that setting, the risk of transmission is much higher to the infant. As Martha said, it's about 30%, not the 1 to 4% range. And all of those infants would get drugs anyway. They would get about 2 drugs to prevent transmission. And again, our goal is to prevent transmission. So the way we approach the mothers is to say that our main goal here is to prevent transmission. You didn't know you were infected, but you have virus in your bloodstream. There's high risk of transmission. In this setting, we'll give your baby. The minimum for prophylaxis is 2 drugs. But we know now that HIV treatment doesn't cure the infection in infants. So it means lifelong treatment. We now have a single case of a child who was treated early, like the Mississippi child. And this is what was great about the media coverage of the Mississippi child. Around the world, many women and communities are aware of this outcome. And so it's actually made it a lot easier to approach families about such a clinical trial. And so we'll say we know about this case. It's a single case like Mr. Brown, where an infant got treated within the first 30 hours of life that led to this unique finding. And so are you interested in enrolling in your child to get 3 drugs instead of 2 drugs? And in that context, the child will be followed very closely to look for toxicities, etc. But it's really a dialogue with the mom, explaining the risk and potential benefit.
So what are the side effects of these drugs on babies? Yeah, one of them.
So there are side effects of these drugs. We don't know the side effects of using a 3-drug regimen to a newborn. But we do know that in general, the 3 drugs that are used are AZT, 3TC, and aspirin, which are standardly used for prevention of transmission. And that's what the clinical trial will look at, is really what's the toxicity of the drugs. I mean, you have to remember in the beginning, when AZT was first used to prevent mother-to-child transmission, no one knew the toxicity of these drugs. These were pregnant women, who signed up for clinical trials. It's really moved the field this much forward. And I think pregnant women and mothers are very interested in protecting their infants from getting infected. We know that, again, as I said, the main goal is to prevent infection. As part of the clinical trial, that's why this is being done in the clinical trial. We can monitor these kids very, very closely during the process. Thank you.
There's a gentleman up here who's
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious about when we were talking about doing testing in rural areas. It's kind of one of my specific interests. And I don't know enough about specifically babies and what if you can test for antibodies in the blood and you best use a rapid test, or if you have to test the RNA, which would be one of the longer tests. And if you have to test the RNA, if the new, and I know that they're not like really out, but the new research around the testers that go on to the smartphones, and if that would be an option that would work with this particular topic.
Great. So in infants, you need to test for RNA or the nucleic acid genetic part of the virus. You can't test for antibodies because mothers transfer their antibodies to babies. Part of the reason that babies are protected from autism early in life, and also you get vaccines at 9, 12, 15 months of age. You have the maternal antibodies that you carry with you as an infant until they wear off.
So, should they, because they're going to live their lives, you know, they're going to go to school, college, whatever. I mean, maybe someone who is HIV negative, how are they able to interact with this other person and then with the family without putting them at risk? How does that work? I know it's possible to do it, but how?
I'll answer one part, the second part of it, and she can talk about the whole HIV. But my husband of 8 years is HIV negative. And the science has advanced so much now that people that are HIV negative can actually take a pill. It's called pre-exposure prophylaxis. And they can prevent, they're negative, they take that pill and they don't have to contract the virus. In my case, I have been virally undetectable, so my virus is undetectable for the full duration of my marriage. Well, actually, I did it last year, but my virus is undetectable. And we had babies the regular way. So he didn't get infected during that process. And they have been trials now that have proved that if your virus, you're undetectable, you can actually not pass on the virus to somebody else. So that is a possibility that you can have a normal relationship. You can have a family like I do, even if you're an HIV positive person. Even though there's a lot of stigma around that. My OBGYN felt I had no business having children as an HIV positive woman. So we're still fighting the stigma around this in many different arenas, but it's not possible.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons that antiretroviral therapy is so important, is because it decreases the risk of transmission to the United States. As for the virus and mixing, it's possible but rare, right? I could be wrong about this. I'm not a virologist, I'm actually a But my understanding is that it's possible but rare. So,
And what happens like if I have one strain of the virus and maybe you have a stronger strain that would affect my immune system faster,
So
and I get it from you, then what happens to me? Like,
I think the issue is to do with resistance, from what I understand. So, is an effect. Like if I'm taking a certain, I've been on medications, and I've been through many rounds, really, of different medications, and I have become resistant to some. And if I have a partner who may not, could have taken that medication, but ended up, with me, then they might end up getting that resistance from me and not ever be able to use that medication. That's the amount of how I understand it. You can, transfer your resistance to somebody else.